Уважаемые коллеги,
Esteemed colleagues, let me announce that next session stands open, and it will be dedicated to the most vulnerable region of the world, Middle East. And before I pass the floor to our esteemed speakers, let me say a few words in terms of introduction. The Middle East and issues related to that are debated very actively, and the very topic which we have announced this session incorporates the questions related to the potential crisis of nation-states in the Middle East, whether such a crisis really takes place and what are the root causes of it. Can we speak about the crisis of identity? Are there clashes along the lines of the political factors, where this is a clashes between different civilizations or between different mentalities? These questions are clearly very topical. We see that this region has not yet lived through the consequences of heavy wars and interventions and the mistakes and faults committed during the resolution of this conflict is a common topic. For instance, our American colleagues, they dissolved the party which was supported by the majority of the population, and American colleagues dissolved the army, the consequences of which are very much pronounced today. I will not focus on these repercussions, but most importantly, the consequences of that situation have not been remedied since the year 2003, and we see multiple multi-ethnic conflicts in the Middle East. And let us remember also that the occupational authorities were involved in the implementation of the so-called Shia project based on two Iraqi parties which are still in power. This is the Party of Convocation and the Supreme Council of the Revolution, and their positions probably are even stronger than the Maliki government's positions. And despite the presence of the occupational forces and troops there, 500,000 people were killed for the last decade, a lot of refugees, and out of 1,400,000 Christians, only 350,000 are still living there, and Shabakis and even Kurds are being expelled from that region. And naturally, Libya, as a failed state right now, is one of the sources of the proliferation of the smuggled arms, and also is one of the sources of rebels and insurgents, which is feeding many movements. There were numerous root causes, and not only the external interference and intervention. And for instance, in Tunisia, the external factor was not so pronounced, and probably Tunisia is one of the success stories of a nation which survived through the Arab Spring. And right now we are witnessing the uprise, sudden or not sudden, of the Islamic movements and forces, or what we call the IS, which used to be ISIS. And I would like to address this question to the speakers, to the panelists. I don't think that this is just an uprising of some fanatics or zealots, but this is rather a project of building a statehood. Actually, the IS is functioning very well. They are restoring agriculture. They are paying salaries and wages. They are restoring the utility services, and people are serving in the militia for money, and actually Sunni population, which was rather anxious about the domination of Shia, people, they are still living under the rule of the IS, and even a question which arises is probably that this movement is unconquerable. So, and this movement has a lot of military potential. This is for the first time that the Americans dropped the ammo and necessary weapons to the Kurds who are surrounded, who are under siege. And already today we heard the news that the IS fighters got hold of these weapons and this ammo, and it's very difficult to predict what would be the end of that situation, and not just the airstrikes. And even if a ground operation starts, although no one wants to fight there, probably will not bring about a resolution to this situation. This evil cannot be conquered, cannot be fought only with the military means, and there should be some international will to put an end to this evil. And certainly when violence is used in order to bring another violence to an end, it will not end with anything good. Certainly the problem of foreign rebels and mercenaries which arrive from all over the world is quite topical. And the last thing I would like to mention, we mentioned the conspiracy theory more than once. There is one more conspiracy theory which was outlined on the 16th of October in New York Times by a person who I respect a lot, Thomas Friedman, who called his column Pump War, and he suggested that the United States, together with Saudi Arabia, started an oil or petroleum war against Russia in order to dramatically drop the prices, because such plummeting of the oil prices cannot be explained by any other reason but that. And this rapid fall of the oil prices was compared by him by the actions done by the same stakeholders under the USSR. And so he suggested that actually this is an attempt to kill two birds with one stone, to actually kill both the Russian economy and the Iranian economy. So what do you think about that? There are also people who represent different parties of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and just one comment, I was very much surprised. Actually, I liked it very much when Secretary Kerry said that the unregulated nature, the fact that Arab-Israeli conflict is still not settled down, is due to the uprise of the Islamic movement. And he was told that he understands nothing about this region, and Ivan was offended for such an insult to Mr. Kerry, because he does a lot in order to bring about peace in that region, and so we know that Americans do a lot in order to help Israel. And now I'm passing the floor to our first panelist, our first speaker, Seamus Milne. He is a reporter and columnist of The Guardian newspaper.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks very much, Vitaly. The title of this session is Crisis in the Middle East. And I think there's no doubt that there is a general crisis now throughout the entire region, which is unparalleled globally and is unprecedented regionally going back centuries, though you can certainly see the origins of this crisis clearly in the carve-up of the Middle East by the colonial powers after the First World War. So, I mean, most dramatically, the crisis expresses itself in Iraq and Syria, but it's also clearly there in Libya and Egypt, in Lebanon and the Palestinian territories, in Yemen and across the Gulf. And we're talking about a cataclysmic state breakdown, sectarian war, ethnic cleansing on a huge scale, and relentless outside intervention, punitive war, and violent repression of democracy that has been taking place throughout the region. And the consequences of it in Europe couldn't be clearer in the stream of refugees and the mass bloodletting, effectively, that is taking place in the Mediterranean Sea of refugees trying to escape the conflict zones into Europe. I think the latest phase of the crisis was clearly triggered from the Arab uprisings, and I would argue the intervention of Western and Gulf states who tried to commandeer, crush, or co-opt those movements for democratic change and social justice. That led directly, first of all, to the NATO intervention in Libya, which played the decisive role in regime change in Libya, while it was carried out in the name of saving lives, but at the same time increased the death toll by around tenfold, triggered very large-scale ethnic cleansing, and delivered a failed state and continuing civil war 3 years later. It also led to the Saudi and UAE intervention to suppress the uprisings in the Gulf, and the coup in Egypt, which overthrew an elected president and killed thousands of people and jailed tens of thousands. And it's also clearly generated proxy wars, most obviously in Syria, with the aim of overthrowing the Assad regime and in the process creating a failed state zone which has spilled over into Iraq and has created the conditions for the rise and advance of the so-called Islamic State. But I think it's also clear that the wider motor of the current Middle East crisis can be found in the launch of the war on terror in 2001 and the original invasion of Afghanistan by the Western powers that year, and crucially and most dramatically in the US and British-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, which itself triggered what can only really be described as a rampage of international illegality, since we're talking about new rules and no rules today. Because the war on terror not only spread terror and jihadist groups across the region that it was supposed to be combating, but the Iraq war and the occupation of Iraq destroyed the state, killed hundreds of thousands, as Vitaly has already said, fostered sectarianism in Iraq and across the region, and brought Al-Qaeda and then what became IS into a country where it had never been before. And if you combine that with the ongoing Western support for Israeli occupation and colonization and client dictatorships and autocracies across the region, and the driver of this crisis, the underlying driver, is clear enough. Now, that's not to deny agency to the people of the region, let alone the failure of the post-colonial states in the Middle East. And of course, there are many, many agents and powers throughout the region who are continually demanding Western and foreign intervention, or to deny the multiple ethnic, religious, social conflicts and tensions in the area. But they, of course, long predate the crisis and the scale of the crisis that we're talking about, and can't be separated in any significant way from the prolonged and escalating Western intervention across the Middle East. And I think you have to stand back and say that the fundamental fact underlying this situation is that uniquely in the world, I would say, the wider Middle East has never been fully decolonized and was never fully decolonized after the Second World War. And we're not only there talking about Israel, but the continual unilateral Western intervention, the permanent military bases and presence, and the sponsorship of dictatorial regimes throughout the period and throughout the region. And of course, that is directly related to oil wealth and the concentration of oil wealth in the territory of the Gulf autocracies in particular, which are, of course, legitimized by a Wahhabist, Salafist, Takfiri ideology, which has then been exported all over the wider Muslim world and is directly related to the ideology of the so-called Islamic State. Now, it's a long-standing cliché of the region that the curse of oil is not only in the Middle East of its own existence and the role it plays, but it's in the wrong place. It's in the place where there aren't people. It's in the place where the colonial boundaries were drawn round it to protect it. Now, it's also obviously the case that there is intervention by other foreign powers in the region, not only by the US and its allies, Britain and France and others, notably by the USSR and Russia more recently. But it's not remotely comparable with the role of the US and the Western powers, either in scale or in its use of force or in its connection with the role of resources in the region. The Western and Israeli role in the Middle East has no parallel anywhere else in the world, and it shapes the inability of the region to develop viable states, rather than being a question, I would argue, of some disembodied ideology which appeared out of nowhere, or eternal sectarian splits, or even the sectarian religious divide. But the response to the failure, and in fact the disaster, of each intervention and invasion and occupation or punitive Israeli war has in fact been to double down and launch another intervention every time, from Iraq to Somalia. And I think it's a chastening fact that there have been an estimated 94,000 American airstrikes in the region, the wider Middle East, since 9/11. We're talking about a war without end and a war without rules. Now, the latest US-led campaign against the ISIS or IS is already failing and therefore is bound to spread. The IS, I would say, is clearly a symptom rather than the disease itself. But clearly, the talk of the United States withdrawing from the Middle East is at best premature. They're not going anywhere, despite what was clearly at least a partial strategic defeat in its inability to impose its will by force in the earlier occupation of Iraq. Now, I think what's needed in the region is clearly de-escalation of the disastrous Syrian war, a break with the ethnic and sectarian politics bequeathed by the Iraq occupation in particular, and a wider negotiated settlement across borders between the regional powers and their sponsors who are fueling it, and an end to the blank check for the coup makers and dictators in the region. Only the people of the region can overcome this crisis. But given the interests at stake and the Groundhog Day relaunched war on terror response to it, I think the signs are clear that they won't be allowed to. The United States has been unable to find a stable way to keep control of the Middle East and its resources, but it won't let go, and nor will it allow a broader international settlement in the region. So the Middle East crisis, I think, tragically can only deepen and spread, and that's clearly a threat well beyond the borders of the region.
Cliff, сейчас будет выступать Clifford.
Well, now Cliff Cupchin will take the place, take the floor to speak on.
Who spent more than half his career in government, I look forward to question and answer. But I'm going to do something different here. I'm going to take a case study, Iran, and kind of go inductively from Iran to the international system. And I think a lot in the region does ride on this one crisis. So what I'm going to do is three things. Talk about the Iran nuclear talks, talk about the geopolitical implications of them, and then end up with what I believe are what these talks sort of tell us about, the rules of the game and the international system. So then the nuclear talks. They're ongoing, they're all over the newspaper, but my own view is I'm not terribly optimistic, and let me sort of set the ground by just briefly explaining why. I think there's a big gap between the U.S. and Iran on Iran's enrichment capability. We know the numbers of the machines. I don't see that gap being bridged. Secondly, there's a big difference between Iran and the United States. And I could say the P5+1, but I don't think this is about the P5+1. I think it's about Iran and the United States. On Iran's research and development capability on advanced generation centrifuges. It's a big deal, and I don't see common ground. Third, Iran wants tremendous sanctions relief up front. The United States is not willing to grant tremendous sanctions relief up front. Again, a third area where I don't see a bridge being built. The rest of the issues I could tell you how, and I think most people who do this field could tell you how they're going to be solved. Those are three big issues. I think we've seen tremendous effective domestic politics in both countries. The Congress boxes in Obama, the Revolutionary Guards, traditional conservatives box in, I think, Iranian policy. I think we're headed towards a state, and I worry, but this is not my best case. This is where I think we're headed, which is kind of what I do as an analyst, where there is no deal, where there are no more sanctions. The U.S. Congress has what we call a lame duck session during November and December. I don't think there'll be any new bill, but I worry very much about next year, no matter who controls the U.S. Congress, about there being very serious new sanctions, which would end diplomacy and really create a crisis. Let me then say, and this kind of gets to the regional implications here, of what would happen if indeed this doesn't work out. I think it's quite likely that the Congress would move to take significant additional barrels of Iranian crude off the market. I think we'll be talking about Israeli strikes on Iran again, just like we were. It's kind of like Back to the Future. In the region, I think there's significant regional implications. Opportunities would really be lost. Iran, I believe, is willing to work tacitly, if not covertly, with the United States on ISIS, either through the KRG, the Kurdish Regional Government, or through the Iraqis. Over time, I think that could lead to real cooperation. I think it speaks volumes that ISIS is a true terrorist group. In that's one issue, I think, where the U.S. and Iran can agree. But if there's no deal, I think one of the great tragedies is that cooperation will probably not take place. Afghanistan, again, would be a casualty, I think, of a no-deal world. So that even in the region, there are real significant downsides. Now, there's still a fighting chance for a deal, and the structural political science argument still applies. I think that both the U.S. and Iran have a ton of trouble living in what I call a no-deal world. In my view, Iran desperately needs sanctions relief to solve its stagflation problem. Yes, there's been stabilization of the economy, but it's a very weak economy. The United States equally desperately wants to avoid this binary Hobbesian choice of accepting a nuclear weapons capable Iran, whether or not Iran wants to become nuclear weapons capable. The physics is such that it will if it continues with the program. Accepting that and risking another war in the Middle East. Also, as many of you may have noticed, Mr. Obama doesn't have a foreign policy legacy. So this plays, I think, quite big. There is a possibility of compromise. There's this new idea of disconnecting centrifuges. That gets technical, and I won't go into that. But we still could have a deal. It's a close call. Again, sort of going into the implications of a deal for the world. I think Iranian crude would come back on in the first 2 years. It's a lot. It's 1.2 million barrels a day of crude and condensate. And I'll come back to that because it's a problem. But I think Western firms would be in Iran in about 3 years' time. It's a big deal. But most importantly, moderates in both countries, the Rouhani government and the moderates in my country, I think would be empowered. I think we'd see a lot of cooperation, even possibly even public cooperation on ISIS. I think cooperation on Afghanistan, even Iraq, becomes possible. In other words, it's a new and much, much better world, which I think would lend itself to potentially becoming a bedrock to address some of the more structural problems in the Middle East. If you get two countries that are as dynamic, I think, as my country and the Iranian nation working together, it's a very different world. But I would put two caveats here on the what I call the deal world, which doesn't quite rise to be careful what you hope for, but there are problems. First, 1.2 million barrels a day of Iranian crude coming on this oil market. Just think about it. The one thing that I hear when I talk to the private sector right now is if you do anything during this phone call, assure me that there'll be no deal. Promise me there'll be no deal, because then we'll get $50 oil and we'll all be screwed. The Iranians will be screwed, the Russians will be screwed. I mean, there's a tremendous, irony here of this deal coming along and burying the oil-producing community. Secondly, Saudi Arabia. If there's a deal with Saudi Arabia, they'll support the deal publicly and they're going to freak out privately. And I think that's something we all have to think through here. The Saudis, anybody who's been there knows, views a U.S. deal, it's a U.S.-Iran rapprochement that increases Iran's regional power. It would de-link the Saudis even further from the Americans, and they're already quite de-linked, and I think increase the chance and severity of proxy wars with Iran. So that a deal is a rather ironically complicated entity in and of itself. Finally, what does this issue tell us about the international system and where we're going? First, I think it does show the limits of U.S. power, even when, in my view, the U.S. is squarely on its game. And in my view, and we can argue, and I'm sure some of you are going to yell at me, but I think U.S.-Iran policy gets a straight A. I think it's been superb through the Bush administration and on into the Obama administration. We have succeeded in crafting and implementing a very effective sanctions regime, and I will argue that sanctions worked. My friend, the ambassador, well, I'm sure will disagree with me, but we're friends and we can have that argument. But the irony from a political science point of view is it should have worked. It should have prevailed. It hasn't. It hasn't. So it tells us that even a hegemon using great economic power can't necessarily beat a determined opponent. That's one lesson. I think it also shows us that structural political science, I think Iran embarrasses Ken Waltz. It shows us that structure does not often or always trump domestic politics. We have propound domestic politics in both countries, screwing up structural arguments. I find that kind of fascinating. For Russia, I think the deal, no deal has tremendous implications. Just 2 minutes, 1 minute, okay? If there's a deal, look, under-captured by our amazing Western press, I think many of the most creative ideas in the P5+1 talks have come out of the Ministry of Mead, have come out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. The Russia plan, they've been very, very creative. On the other hand, Russia's moving towards what I would call a club of sanctioned nations in helping the Iranians break the sanctions regime. That's not where Russia belongs. So I think there's a big choice here as to how this looks for Russia in the end. 2 quick final points, Vitaly, very quick, I promise. If indeed the Iranian nuclear program resumes, we're looking at again at a dangerous Saudi Arabia that could easily attain a bomb from Pakistan. We have a very, very, very delicate proliferation spiral. The last thing you want, as Thomas Schelling tells us, is young deterrents that are vulnerable. Very final point. The talks, I think, reinforce the idea that the Middle East is the region least amenable to traditional tools of military, economic, and diplomatic leverage. It doesn't really work in this region. As my previous speakers, I think, stated, at least eloquently enough, military power didn't work in Iran and Afghanistan. Well, here, economic and diplomatic power failed. This is a real tough out, this region. The Middle East is not well integrated into the world economy, no security system, which is very important, no conflict resolution system, and in my view, no dominant external power. And I feel strongly about that, but we can come back to that. So rules or no rules, this region is going to be a problem. That's it.
Thank you, Cliff. Mustafa
Barghouti from the Palestinian National Initiative Movement.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon.
By talking a little bit about the general situation in the Middle East, and then of course I'll have to come to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But in my opinion, the situation in the Middle East is enhanced or is affected by 3 factors that are interacting with each other. The first factor, which is sometimes ignored is the internal factor, where the people in most of the countries are unhappy with their governance, unhappy because of the corruption, unhappy because of lack of development, unhappy because of lack of perspective, especially for the younger generation. This is a very important factor, and many are unhappy because of the dictatorships that are controlling the countries. Second factor is the external interventions that have been systematic, organized to weaken most of the states or their governments. Major countries that interfere here is the United States, of course, with concentration of the energy policy and the control of energy in the Middle East. But other countries, including some European countries, and of course Israel, which has been instrumental, in my opinion, in designing the American policy when it comes to Iran or Iraq. The third factor is the struggle between regional powers, and which sometimes reflect themselves in what they call proxy wars. And here we can notice three major regional powers that are struggling with each other, including Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Of course, all of this is happening in the ranks of a huge transformation of our world, where the world has moved from bipolar system to unipolar system, and now it's moving to multipolar system within a relatively very short period of time. And that, in my opinion, is creating a lot of confusion. This is leading to enhancing sectorial fights, enhancement of unjustified religious factors, the absence of state rule, and very serious fragmentation. And practically, this is leading to two contradictive processes. The first process is that the wish of some superpowers to weaken the countries in this region and weaken their people is being achieved. But as we usually say, beware of what you are wishing for. This is leading to a second process where the fragmentation and instability is so severe that it is beginning to affect even the interest that was the goal of these countries that intervened in this place. And Libya is a very good example of that, and Iraq as well. So in my opinion, the idea of controlling the region so that there can be control of the energy resources is becoming counterproductive, and it is leading to unexpected results, some of which are, the example of some of which is the rise of Daesh and what you call the Islamic State. But it reflects a much deeper factor here, which is the lack of responsible policy that should have been based on balancing the strategic interest of all the players, whether in the region or worldwide. And this irresponsible policy is leading, of course, to drastic results. Israel has tried to abuse, most recently, this situation in two directions. One direction was the attack on Gaza. And since I've been in Gaza during the war, at least for 3 weeks during the war, let me share with you some information that might shock you or some of you, because unfortunately, many of the facts were not reflected in the world media. The attack on Gaza by Israel was not an attack on Hamas. It was an attack on all the Palestinian people. And it led to serious massacres, war crimes, according to many international observers, and definitely crimes against humanity. Within 551 days, Gaza's size was reduced from 140 square miles to 70 square miles, with 1.8 million people living there. And during 51 days, Israel bombarded Gaza with 21,000 tons of explosives, which is equal to 2 small nuclear bombs. And they even exhausted their whole arsenal of tank bombs that they had to open the American strategic reservoir and take weapons from it. And that led, of course, besides the death of 70 Israelis, including 65 soldiers who were invading Gaza, there were 2,160 Palestinians killed, including 580 children. 83% of the people killed were civilians, and 85% were killed inside their homes, in addition to 11,300 injured and 50,000 homes destroyed. A whole town like Shuja'iyya was completely grounded to earth. This did not happen even during the Second World War. The level of devastation was unprecedented. And by the way, Israel used things like, which were never reported by CNN or BBC, of course, although we provided them with photos and pictures of that. They even used explosive barrels that were thrown from F-16 jet fighters to destroy vast areas. These numbers might sound small to you, but let me remind you that if what has happened in Gaza has happened in a country like the United States with its population, you would be talking about 400,000 people killed and approximately 2 million people injured. That was the scope of the damage, including, of course, 91 families that were completely eliminated and scratched from the civil record. We're not talking here about the death of a man and his wife, but his children, his grandchildren, his grandfather, etc. To add insult to injury, there was this conference in Cairo about reconstruction of Gaza. And unfortunately, this conference, in my opinion, did not provide real solutions because the devoted amount of money for reconstruction will be controlled completely by the Israeli siege on Gaza, which was not lifted. But more than that, even the amount of money that was declared, which is $5.2 billion, we discovered later that about 60% of it was the same money that is given to the PA multiplied by 3 years. And it has nothing to do with the construction of Gaza. On the other hand, while Israel did all these atrocities and continued to enjoy this level of impunity to international law, Israel has encountered severe resistance, which it did not expect. And I think, in a way, Israel has exposed itself because it has exposed the fact that there is no war without a price. Netanyahu said we had to get out of Gaza because we don't want our soldiers to die, and we don't want to be exhausted with a long-acting war while we face other threats. In other words, Israel's security impunity was violated, as much as its moral impunity has been affected. Their legal impunity could also be affected if finally the Palestinians decide to go to the International Criminal Court. But the second side of the Israeli attack was not directed at Gaza. It is going on today against the so-called peace process. I'm not going to talk about crazy ministers like Lieberman, Naftali Bennett, or Ori Ariel. I'm going to talk about Netanyahu and his deputy minister, Ya'alon, who have been talking about the following things. They've been saying that the Israeli army should remain in the West Bank forever. Ya'alon has been saying in a most recent interview that there is no place for Palestinian state. What Palestinians could have is only an autonomy under Israeli control. And you can call it an empire if you want, but it will remain a self-governing authority. And he said, we're not seeking a solution. All we are seeking is managing the conflict. What does that mean? First, it means the end of Oslo and the end of the so-called peace process, which has become the substitute to peace. Second, it consolidates a system of apartheid and discrimination, which many Israelis admit, much worse than what prevailed in South Africa. And third, it encourages Palestinian tendencies that say that we need an alternative strategy based on popular nonviolent resistance, but also with boycott, divestment, sanctions campaigns against Israeli policy, as well as political resistance, including the fight in the UN and in other places. In other words, what we face here is what's going to be a long-standing fight. The Israelis are imposing their physical facts on the ground with settlements. Palestinians will try to impose their own political facts on the ground. Kerry, as you mentioned, tried to link or to say to the Israelis that what is happening to Palestinians is affecting the region, and for that he was accused of anti-Semitism, which is really very funny. Unfortunately, and this is my conclusion, what we see today in the Middle East is a combination of failing states and irrational and irresponsible states like Israel. In both cases, the end for such situation is sad, but it also says that there is a great need for a serious change in terms of policy regarding this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ну и, наконец, последний...
And finally, our final presenter, Shlomo Ben-Ami, used to be in charge of Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now he is Vice President of Toledo International Center on Peace. It's a public and non-governmental organization with very interesting projects.
Not shun entirely the Israeli-Palestinian situation, but I will try and respect the instructions of the moderator to put it in regional context. In the last 8 years, the Arab world has seen two major awakenings. The awakening of 1936, 1939, and the current awakening. The difference is that the first awakening had to do with the rebellion of the Arab world or the Arab peoples against colonialism, against external forces, and emerging Zionism as well. The current awakening is much more inward-looking. I mean, it is not about the dark forces of colonialism or imperialism. It is about what my friend Mustafa said, incompetence, corruption, domestic issues essentially, and the drive of the younger generation for respect, dignity, and human rights. Nonetheless, in fact, one can see that however inward-looking this might be, it has already far-reaching strategic consequences for the region. I mean, one cannot avoid but looking at the tremendous consequences that we have here. It's not only internal, although it started as internal. First, we can see a major crisis of confidence between the United States and its traditional allies in the region. The Saudis, for them, the fact that an Arab state like Iraq has become Shiite dominated is a calamity of historic dimensions. They have seen how the US betrayed an ally like Mubarak. The Israelis have seen, or Netanyahu in particular, has seen a deal behind his back with Iran. He doesn't believe that his old paradigm of Bushehr versus Yitzhar, that is, give me a denuclearized Iran and I'll give you a Palestinian state, assuming that he ever meant it, doesn't work and will not work. He doesn't believe that he can now make the historic concessions for the Palestinian state. Traditionally, in Israel, you had always two strategic lines of thought. The left always saw the centrality of the Palestinian problem, and the solution of the Palestinian problem is the avenue, is the introduction to the solution of the wider issues emanating from the outer circle. The right saw the outer circle as the center. It might have been also some sort of a pretext, a way to avoid the Palestinian problem, but they always say, and Netanyahu belongs to this school, that unless the broader region offers the security that Israel can accept, then she cannot make what Sharon used to call the painful concessions to the Palestinians. Now, we see that a collapse of the so-called axis of resistance. This is also one of the consequences. May I remind you that these axes consisted of Iran, Turkey in a way, because Erdogan was the most popular guy after Nasrallah in recent years among the Arab masses. So you are seeing now an estrangement between Iran and Turkey over the issue of Syria. Obviously, there are major differences when it comes to Syria. And now, with Erdogan practically colluding with ISIS in terms of the discourse. And we saw not long ago ISIS criticizing Sykes-Picot, and the other day in a speech at the Istanbul University, Erdogan did just the same. I mean, he criticized Sykes-Picot. There was an arrangement that lasted for 100 years, is now collapsing, and Turkey seems to be interested proactively in its change. Now, and you see also a fragmentation, as it were, or an exhibition of the built-in fragility of the concept of the Arab state. It's not only the Arab state as such, but I mean the very concept of the Arab state. The Arab states in the Middle East have yet to come to their Westphalian agreement. Right now, they are before Westphalia. They are in the 30-year war in Europe. That is, this is the Shiite-Sunnite divide that is diluting the centrality of the Palestinian problem. And perhaps even the Kurdish drive to a nation state is diluting also the centrality of the Palestinian problem. These are the things that, to some strategic thinkers in Israel, looks as very good news. Because, you see, what is the point of creating? Is this such a brilliant idea? Will tell you Netanyahu and these acolytes, is this such a brilliant idea to create yet another state in the Middle East where the traditional states are collapsing? And this new, supposedly new state is split between a force of the past, that is secular nationalism, and the force of the future, which is Hamas, religious nationalism verging on jihadism. So the whole setup has changed in a very dramatic way, in my view, and has put the Palestinian problem in a different corner when it comes to the concerns of the parties. Moreover, Israel has now, precisely because of the loss of confidence of some key Arab actors in the region towards the US, Israel has become the concubine. She has developed a concubine-style relations with Saudi Arabia, because she sees how the traditional security envelope is collapsing. This traditional security envelope of Israel was based on a stable Hashemite kingdom in Jordan. A historian once called, before the peace between Israel and Jordan, used to call Jordan as Israel's best enemies, one of Israel's best enemies, or the best of enemies. Now, that stability is not that stable. You could hear the king yesterday uttering quite strong remarks on Israeli policies, and but Netanyahu will give it his own interpretation. This is the traditional need of an Arab ruler to square the circle between the masses and the need to reach out to Israel at the same time. I mean, if he wants to be a good friend of Israel, he needs to criticize her in public. So he doesn't still see that this might reflect a genuine problem, and that the Jordanian kingdom is in dire straits, in dire trouble. Now, so I think this is one aspect of the changes we are seeing. The second question, in my view, has to do with what would Israel do if indeed the so-called American withdrawal from the region is serious, is something that will eventually happen. It will have to develop its own sovereign policies for the region, and it will have to understand that to try again an alliance which goes against nature with Arab states without addressing whether we want it or not. The region is in flux, yes. Palestine is no longer, or for the time being, is not that central in the preoccupation of the nations of the region, yet I think it is not an issue that will disappear. And at the end of the day, any attempt by Israel to reach solid, ironclad settlements with the Arab world by circumventing the Palestinian problem, in the long run, it will not prevail. I don't see that possible. And therefore, Israel cannot escape the need to address the Palestinian problem. One last sentence. Since I do not believe that there is any chance whatsoever for an Israeli-Palestinian settlement when the parties reach it in free negotiations between them, in bilateral negotiations, such a scenario, please do me a favor, forget about it. It doesn't exist and it will not exist. It is impossible. And I can develop another seminar about it if you wish. The only scenario that is possible is something that comes from outside the region. But this is precisely where we have in the collapse of the concept of international community that we have today a problem. What is the international community exactly? Will the US be able to create an international alliance for peace in the Middle East when it is estranged from Russia, when the Chinese have their own thing, when Europe is not what one would have expected, etc.? So this is my 7 minutes or 8, I don't know. Okay.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much. No one of the panelists wanted actually to specify or clarify if there is any war, oil war against Russia or Iran. And when you take the questions from the floor, still would like to say that President Assad in the West, is he still regarded within the framework of the famous mantra that he should go, he should quit or leave, or Bashar Assad might be regarded as one of the important allies in the war against jihadism? Peter Dudkevich, you're welcome to ask the first question.
Piotr Dudkiewicz, Carleton University. Gentlemen, this is the question to Mustafa and to Shlomo. Let's jump to the future for a second. And let's assume that we have an independent Palestinian state. Then, question to Mustafa. What are the chances that this independent Palestinian state will join the group of the failed states? Taking into account what we know about how Palestinian Authority is managing its own affairs. And what will be the implication for the larger region of having failed Palestinian state as a result? And then, question to Shlomo. Let's assume that that is a failed Palestinian state. What kind of the security and other threats this failed state will possess to Israel? At the same time, what kind of the dynamics it will be changed by having this failed state instead of the occupied territory?
Кто-нибудь хочет сразу ответить? Или мы...
Anyone wants to take this question, or will collect all the questions? So let us listen to several questions and you will take all of them. So, Representative Turkey.
Ankara, Turkey. Because Turkey have been mentioned several times, I cannot hesitate not to say anything. 2 points. One, I would like to hear from all the speakers what is your position towards Turkish behavior and policy in general towards the Middle East. The second question is, Turkey is not having diplomatic relations with Syria, Egypt, Israel, and some Libya. So the Turkish involvement in the Middle East is not colonial, is not because of oil, etc., as Milne has been also mentioning. But Turkey claims to be one part of the new order in the Middle East. This is a very interesting claim. Whether it's successful or not is another thing. But Turkey wanted to be one of the rule setters in the Middle East. At the end of the day, she is not. And now we have ISIS, we have Kurds, and as I would say bonus, the American bombing from above. which destroys so many things. You cannot bomb climate, but you can bomb some ISIS tanks. But it's like killing the mosquitoes. I mean, the question is Israeli policy also and the Palestinian policy. In Turkey, we have very, very sympathetic attitude towards the Palestinians, and at the moment, very negative attitude towards Israel. But I would like to get from Mustafa one answer. The Turkish Prime Minister, as well as President, they always refer to our Muslim Arab brothers, that we share the same faith. This is the statement of Davutoğlu and Tayyip Erdoğan. Is there any Arab leader, one statement, which considers that the Arabs and the Turks have common faith in the Middle East? Is it one-sided love that the Turks think like this, or is it a love based on togetherness? Or are you forcing us to make the strategic choice to love Israel more than ever?
Thank you. Andronik Migranyan, потом Alexander Rar.
Yes, thank you, and then Alexander Rar. And then you can pass the mic to Delia again. Andronik? Andronik, this is your turn now. Frankly speaking, but I cannot but react to our Turkish colleagues' intervention. Probably when former colonial power says that it loves its former colony, it causes a lot of mistrust. But this is not my question. I actually wanted to react to that as a representative of a nation which used to live next to you. And you probably know that Migranyan, this is an Armenian last name. I have a question to Shlomo. I'm very much interested how Israel imagines and what is its attitude towards the change of the balance between Shias and Muslims in the Middle East, because the American policy is aimed at the destruction of Bashar Assad's regime. And Vitaly Nomkin asked about Bashar Assad, so I cannot but mention that. So probably this policy aims at rupturing the ties with Hezbollah, with Syria, etc. But I think that if this balance of forces is destroyed, if this link is removed, I mean, if Bashar Assad has to go, then Israel will find itself in a very difficult situation, because Sunnis will be more powerful, Shias would be more aggressive, and Sunni Islam actually is very active everywhere in Afghanistan. Also, this is true of the IS. Don't you think that this destruction of the balance between Shias and Muslims might be very threatening strategically for Israel? Alexander Rar, then Deliagin, and when we'll ask our panelists to take the questions. I certainly would like to put an end to the Ukrainian crisis, and I hope very much that the United States and Russia will find some common ground for the agenda to work in the Middle East. So where can we find this common platform, common agenda for Russia and the United States? For instance, will the United States need Russia to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan? Will Russia play any role there? And what is the aim of the actually? What's the Russian interest? Whether the Islamists push away the Bashar Assad regime or not? So my name is Deliagin, and this is a question to everyone. What's the cause of such a dramatic change of the attitude of the Americans to Islamic fundamentalism? We remember very well that after a historic statement made by Obama in Cairo University, the leaders of Muslim Brotherhood were invited, and after that, the Islamic fundamentalism became a tool in the hands of the American policy, foreign policy. And we saw the same thing in Syria and in Libya when actually IS seized Mosul and they threatened the region. And the Americans promised just to send the military advisors in 6 months, actually. And why the Islamic fundamentalists, which used to be one of the tools, one of the instruments in the hands of the American foreign policy, now they have made a U-turn. Now we see that the sanctions against Iran are lifted, and again sanctions against Russia are imposed. Is it because Iran proved that it cannot be destroyed, and the idea to destroy Russia is still persisting, or Iran is considered to be a more westernized and democratic nation than Russia? And lastly, I associate myself with a question about Bashar Assad. So is he same ominous figure as Mr. Putin, or he is kind of rehabilitated in the eyes of the world community? Let us start with Mustafa Barghouti, and then other speakers would follow.
I have many questions. The first question about failing state. I don't think that if a Palestinian state is established, it will become a failing state, because I think we do have the internal elements and factors. Don't forget that Palestinians have held so many countries in the region during the last 40 years, build up their own countries. I mean, I'm not talking about building up the regimes, but their economy, their education, their health, etc. Second, we were, I think, ahead of every other country in the Arab world in trying to build a democratic model, something that was destroyed by Israeli intervention. But I don't think any other country had the free and democratic elections that we had in 2005 and 2006. And if our national unity government was allowed to continue to function and was not put under siege and sanctions, I think you would have seen a completely different picture today. What I am sure of is that if Palestine is not established as an independent state, Israel will become a failing state, in the sense that Israel will consolidate as a country of colonialism, occupation, and a system of apartheid that makes the old apartheid system in South Africa looks like something very good. This is the future that Israel is facing. And that's why I would say the establishment of an independent Palestinian state is a very crucial element. Otherwise, what's the solution? They're either apartheid or one-state solution. And one-state solution is even more difficult. Second question about Turkey. No, I think in the case of Palestine, there is a great appreciation of the Turkish position in terms of supporting the Palestinian cause in general and standing up to Israel against its occupation. But one has to also see, I want to mention here two elements which are important. So it's not love from one side, but there are other important elements which I think people should think about. We should not forget that few decades ago, Israel had two major allies in the region. Their first ally was Turkey under the previous regime, and their second ally was Iran. They were in struggle with Egypt at that time. And the transformation that we see today is amazing. But I believe that Turkey also is paying more attention to the Middle East because Turkey is kept outside Europe. This is a very important factor in the sense that the European intention, the Turkish intention to join the European Union was practically obstructed. And of course, it's just natural for Turkey that it will turn a lot of its attention to what's happening to the Middle East, which is not foreign to it. Third question about, I want just to touch on this issue about fundamentalism and Islam as a rising power in the region. Well, at least in the Palestinian case, you have to see this as a self-defense action. The national regimes and the national forces have failed. So this is one of the reasons why some people turn to Islam. I mean, for a while, the Muslim Brothers, for instance, inside the Palestinian territories were, in a way, accepted by Israel and even helped by it. But the failure of Fatah, the failure of the PLO, the fact that Israel did not cooperate and did not allow the negotiations to succeed, of course, is leading to these phenomena. Finally, I hope that that people will be more careful about exaggerating the Shia-Sunni conflict or contradiction. I don't know how much this is an internal factor and how much of it is enhanced by external intervention. Otherwise, I could ask a question of, what do you think about the possible contradiction between Catholic people and Protestants in Europe? I mean, this sounds crazy if you ask this question. But maybe 20 years ago, the same thing would have sounded crazy if we talk about Shiite and Sunnite. So let's put things in the right perspective here and not transform the results into causes.
Okay, Shlomo.
Well, yes, when it comes to Palestine, Israel's choices are all bad. In fact, I mean, if indeed it becomes a failed state, it's a bad option. And if you don't reach a settlement, it is a very bad option, as Mustafa said. I mean, the specter of an Israeli apartheid state, which is inevitable once you have one state solution. So, this would be a South African situation without a South African solution. I don't see Israel ever agreeing to the rule by the majority. My concern now is has mostly to do with the pre-state situation in Palestine. That is, if Abu Mazen, who is almost 80 years old, and quits politics and decides to disappear from the political scene, we will have a very, very serious problem to even start addressing again the question of negotiations and reaching a reasonable solution with a Palestinian partner. That's a very serious problem. The second thing about Turkey, if I may, I see Turkey as a power in search of a role. This is what happens with the Turks. I mean, they were snubbed by the Europeans, and then they came to the Middle East and said, we are going now to have zero problems with the environment. I don't know, is this the habit of Erdogan to promote failed ministers of foreign affairs? I mean, because the entire architecture has collapsed of Davutoglu. No, I mean everything that he said has collapsed. Problems with Syria, problems with Iran, problem with the Kurds, problem with just about everybody, problems with Israel. So I think that, and now you are trying to look for.
With the exception of Barzani.
Pardon?
With the exception of Barzani.
Yes, that's right, with the Turks, because he's not close to him. I mean, he has problems with the PKK, and he has problems with the Kurds in Syria. Now, extremely difficult to say where this will end up. Well, the entire region will end up, but obviously we will have to see what happens with ISIS. This collusion creates a very serious problem for Turkey with its Western allies. Here you have a key NATO member with a discourse that is, simply out of tune with anything you can imagine for a NATO member. So that's basically an internal problem for Turkey. I believe what the internal domestic politics will do for Turkey. When it comes to Bashar al-Assad, the Israelis always oscillated here between two views. One, it's better to have the devil, I mean, Bashar al-Assad, we know him. He has respected, not the entire Assad dynasty has respected stability on the Golan Heights, somehow swallowed the practical annexation of the Golan Heights, and there was, since 1974 to this very day, not one shot was fired on the Golan Heights. Not one shot. The only shots that were fired now have to do with instability along the border. So, but there was the second view that you can see among Israeli thinkers is that, yes, but if Bashar falls, this will be a severe blow to the Iranians. So you have Iran as the major enemy, so if the Iranians are denied of a key Arab ally, and they put the emphasis on the word Arab, because for the Iranians to have a key Arab ally is important in their Middle Eastern discourse, in their Middle Eastern political maneuvering, to say we are not a foreign Persian element that is trying to interfere in the questions of the Arab Middle East. We are supported by a Syrian Arab ally. Well,
that's it.
That's essentially.
Okay, Cliff,
yeah.
Please.
Okay, I'll just be brief. Sasha, U.S.-Russian relations in the Middle East. First of all, again, I think Iran is overlooked. It's still working, despite everything else failing. I think cooperation is good and it's ongoing. But otherwise, it's the Middle East is a casualty. There could be a lot of cooperation on humanitarian issues in Syria. There's not. ISIS is, I think, ripe for cooperation. I think a lot of Americans, including myself, are a bit confused about President Putin's condemnation of U.S. bombing. ISIS is exactly what I've heard every time I've come into this country, is exactly what the Russians have been fearing. Well, they got it, but I'm not sure what Russia's doing. Quickly on fundamentalism, Mikhail Delyagan, I think it's a very good point. Well, it depends what you mean by it. On radical fundamentalism, I don't think the U.S. has ever been confused. It's opposed it. They're mostly on the terrorist list, and we do a lot of things about it. On sort of Morsi and the Brotherhood, and whatever we're doing with Sisi, that's full of contradictions, and I can't say I understand it or would be prepared to defend it. There was an election, the Brotherhood won it, and I think U.S. foreign policy has a problem. And just finally, very quickly, Putin and Assad is just apples and oranges. Assad is, in the United States view, and I would share the view, is a war criminal. Full stop. I think ISIS has thrown him a lifeline. ISIS has changed the subject, but the subject will return to President Assad. Let me leave it there.
Okay. Shimon, please.
Yeah, it's interesting. Shlomo was saying about Bashar al-Assad defending keeping quiet on the Golan Heights border. I mean, in recent months, we've had Jabhat al-Nusra, the affiliate of Al-Qaeda, keeping quiet on the Golan border, which is quite an interesting reflection of these contradictory nature of these things in the region. I mean, just to pick up the point about Islamism and Turkey, because I think it's quite an important point at the moment. I mean, of course, it's true that the United States has used Islamic movements as a tool of American foreign policy, but it's also used secular movements as a tool of American foreign policy, and there has been a spread within both traditions in the region. And I think, I mean, there's a danger, I think, of people getting drawn up in their hostility to Islamism, particularly democratic Islamism, in being drawn into supporting, for example, the Sisi regime in Cairo as some kind of new Nasser of our age, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, it's not only effectively supported militarily and financially by the United States, but very close allies with the Netanyahu government and the autocracies in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and really offers nothing, I think, for the crisis in the region. I mean, the tragedy for the Turkish government and the strand of democratic Islamism that it was trying to espouse in alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood was what's happened in Syria and the way that's played out in the Syria war, and Turkey being drawn in to effectively part of what is a sectarian war played out with some of the most destructive and reactionary forces in the region. I mean, it seems the idea that the rump of the Assad regime is now going to be destroyed unless United States intervention comes to do that, which would show the short-sightedness of the Assad regime's response, I think. But short of that, it's not going to happen. And Syria, like Iraq, is effectively partitioned already. And lastly, on the Sunni-Shia issue, I agree very much with what Mustafa was saying, that the idea that this is some fundamental, elemental schism in the region and the Arab people, it just is clearly wrong. History demonstrates that. And I mean, it's not very long ago that on the Sunni Arab street, Hezbollah and their leader Nasrallah were acclaimed for their resistance to Israel and their espousal of the national cause in the region. So, there's a sequence of events that happened during the Iraqi occupation and the fostering of sectarianism in Iraq deliberately by the occupation forces. There's no doubt about that, that I think played directly into this absolutely destructive trend in the region. But it clearly can be overcome.
Thank you.
Let's collect a couple of questions because we don't have plenty of time. I'll give you, each of you.
Can I? Okay, yeah. This is Chen Dongxiao with the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. I guess my question is mainly to Mr. Kupchan. You have depicted very bleak pictures about the Middle East and chaotic crisis. I think all the panelists have the same impression about that. The rising of the ISIS has just made the situation in the Middle East more worse. And it is largely expected that the United States, Washington, will have to invest more military, diplomatically in the Middle East, despite of those reluctancy. But however, we have seen that this coalition led by the United States fighting against ISIS is it's still quite limited. In this big context, how would you evaluate, or to what extent do you believe that the U.S., the increasingly reinvestment in the Middle East will affect its agenda of pivoting to the Asia Pacific? Thank you.
Пожалуйста, на втором ряду наш коллега, а потом кто бежит.
Добрый день, Matthias Brückmann ist Germany, Gazeta Hand.
Woodman from Germany. I'd like to repeat the questions that Vitaly Naumkin asked about the price on oil and that this is a coordinated attack on Iran or Russia. And so I'd like to repeat that, second with that. And my other question is whether the United States can afford this attack, because the American economic miracle that we are witnessing now mainly consists of, is based on the shale oil and shale gas. But as I understand, the United States cannot survive on $60 per barrel. So do you truly believe that this is an American planned attack, or this time this is the game played by Saudi Arabia against Iran? And because Saudi Arabia is the leading power in the Middle East.
To tie this discussion, if I could, to the discussion this morning on rules and no rules and the development of an international system. The theme so far here has been about the U.S. Either the U.S. People don't like the policy, we should do less, or they don't like U.S. policy, but we should do more. And I think history is what it is, and obviously there are groups, and we've discussed this with Mustafa, about groups in the United States very much still interested in U.S. participation in the creation of two states. But the discussion here, if you noticed, has not been about the Russian role in the Middle East, which is kind of surprising since you do have compatriots, over 1 million of them in Israel. And while the joke in the U.S. is sometimes why you care about some compatriots and not others, but the only initiative, frankly, has been to prevent the U.S. bombing of Syria. And in general, your Syrian policy is keep what is the way it is. Now, we can talk about bad consequences of the Arab Spring, but let's talk about bad consequences of the Iran-Iraq war, which was 1 million people killed, let's talk about some of the bad consequences of what's going on today. So there are bad consequences from letting dictators stay as well. And of course, even good dictators sometimes die. People have a tendency to do that. And then you have unstable situations which are not caused by American policy. And whatever you can say, and we've discussed this yesterday, about Middle East policy, the US Secretary of State did try, and try very hard to get something done. On Chinese policy in the Middle East, somebody here will have to tell me if there is one or if China actually cares. Let me just take 1 minute on the sanctions discussion, because I think it's very important. Obviously, the Iranian sanction policy provided a false analogy for sanctions on Russia. And that has had some consequences. But if there is an agreement with Iran, there will be huge consequences, I think, for the sanctions policy on Russia as well as on Iran. There'll be a huge debate in the United States about lifting sanctions, and there'll be no time left or no political energy left to think about lifting sanctions on Russia. And obviously, US-Iranian rapprochement would have great positive consequences for US on the oil markets and on opening up markets. And I think it's a goal worth having a huge US involvement. My general conclusion has to do with the tone of some of this discussion. I reject the general theme that US activism has never been and is not likely to be making a positive contribution to the resolution of any problem anywhere in the world. It is true the system is more a US system than a Russian or a Chinese or anyone else's system, but there is a system, and we have had remarkable progress under that system. So I hope some of the people who make comments will at least keep some of that in mind.
Thank you. Professor Chelani, you are the one.
Yeah, Brahma Chelani, if I may inject a new issue into the rich debate. The international spotlight remains on the historical Sunni-Shia rivalry as a key driver of geopolitics in the Middle East and beyond. But there's something interesting and disturbing happening in the Sunni world, tectonic fissures in the Sunni world. It is not an accident that the main threats to international peace and security today emanate principally from Sunni actors. ISIS is only the latest threat to international peace and security. Here, if I may mention two fissures that are occurring in the Sunni world that have tectonic implications. One is political and tribal sectarianism in the Sunni world, which is pitting Sunnis versus Sunnis. It is not an accident that we have 7 Sunni states that have become de facto partitioned with little prospect of their being reunited again in the foreseeable future. And the second major fissure occurring is the schism in the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has divided the sheikdoms. And there's little prospect that this rift will be healed anytime soon, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, see Qatar's funding and arming of violent Islamists as a threat to their very existence. So my question really to the speakers is whether these tectonic shifts that are unfolding in the Sunni world, whether they will force a change in the regional policy of the United States, which has had a long-standing alliance with Sunni rulers, including the unsavory rights-abusing types.
Thank you. We have now 5 minutes for the whole team. Please, we'll start from you.
Well, just to pick up that last point that Brahma made, that split between the UAE and Saudi Arabia on the one hand, on Qatar and Turkey on the other, obviously is absolutely central to what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years in Egypt, in the Syrian war, in what's taking place now in Iraq. I mean, it is absolutely fundamental. And the incredible thing is, I mean, in relation to what the impact is on relations with the United States, is that they've more or less continued. And one of the things, unaffected, I mean, although despite the tensions that have been mentioned, and I mean, one of the obvious tactics that has been deployed in the region in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring up to now is to ride both horses, and which is what you'd expect to happen, really. So, comes back to my point about not being drawn into a secular religious divide as the essential and most important divide in the region. I just wanted to pick up the oil point because a couple of people have mentioned it. I mean, from what I understand, there hasn't been any clear leak about that, but the inference must be, I mean, clearly it was a deliberate policy by Saudi Arabia to increase its output dramatically. The only factors that are relevant are the shale oil issue and the Iranian-Russian position. So, to me, it seems a perfectly reasonable assumption and inference that those two things are clearly linked.
Thank you. Please, Cliff.
Let me just run through these quickly. I mean, I guess everybody in this room is free to criticize the American government, including me. And so, to the last question, no, I don't see a shift. There should be one, but from what I see so far, it's kind of the devil you know, and I think there'll be continuity with relationship with the Sunni governments, though that's in many ways unfortunate. Secondly, on the pivot, yes, I do think that the American likely increasing preoccupation or necessity to address ISIS is going to slow the pivot to Asia, to the extent that it's happened. I think it's been pretty slow anyway. Third, just to associate myself with Toby's comments, the U.S. is agent of instability in the Middle East. I think it's way overdone. Yeah, the war with Iraq, nobody's going to look back and say that was a good that was a good move. After that, I think agency lies in the region. I totally agree. Kerry was incredibly brave. He looks really bad right now. I don't think he should regret what he did. The U.S., just take the region that I know the best, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf, it's all the same region. The U.S. is the bedrock of security. Does anybody really want the U.S. to leave? Really, really, really? I mean, when I've been in a certain country that the ambassador's from, that country is often scared of a very quick withdrawal of U.S. forces on an intellectual level, among academics. And I think that does lead, though, given the fact that the U.S. isn't going to be what it was, to the question of China. I mean, what country really needs this? Who needs Middle Eastern oil? I mean, I think we have to look at that really squarely. Who imports half of Iran's oil? Who's on an oil binge buy spree right now? It's China. At some point, I would ask, my Chinese colleagues, again, I'd reinforce the question, what's Chinese policy? To me, the country with the greatest interest in the region is China. The last question, I don't think there's any conspiracy theory here. Look, what's causing $83 Brent? In short, in my view, it is Libya at 900,000 barrels a day. That's likely to disappear because Libya's in bad shape geopolitically. Secondly, is demand destruction in Europe and China. The Saudis have a budget now. They can't live on $70 oil. They're not going to drown Iran, and they're certainly not going to. We'll go to the U.S. in my closing. I know, Vitaly, you're going to come after me. I think the Saudis will cut in the fourth quarter of this year. U.S. starts to suffer at 90. The shale oil plays come off at 90. And I think that's going to further strain U.S.-Saudi relations if the Saudis don't cut, which I think they will do. And that's it.
Shlomo, please.
I think that the U.S. has what one might call the predicament of the superpower. Throughout history, this has been the case that a superpower that tried to establish international norms, international rules, has always been criticized. And I don't know if you came across a novel by the name of The Ugly American. And don't tell me that you only saw the movie with Marlon Brando, but there is a novel where America comes bad whatever it does. They want America in, and when America is in, they criticize him for overdoing or for doing it wrongly. With regard to your point about is it so good to maintain a dictatorship, the only thing I have to say about it is that the conceptual mistake that the U.S. committed here, and it has a lot to do with what we said here about the Arab Spring, is to try and interfere in the historical cycle. And the historical cycle doesn't allow for a democracy in the conditions of Iraq, in the condition of society, in the societal or state culture that existed there, to try and bring democracy on the wings of an F-16. I mean, that was entirely wrong. Another point that is very important is not to try and say that, listen, what is going on in the Arab world, all these religious wars, this is something that is imposed from outside. Religion is a genuine autochthonous force. Actions by outside powers may unleash forces, may strengthen them, weaken them, but they are forces that exist there. I think that one of the major tragedies of this Arab Spring is the failure of Morsi. The failure of the Muslim Brotherhood is a major event. It is in the sense that for the first time, political Islam came to power through elections, and it failed. This is a victory for Al-Qaeda, because that was the discourse of Al-Qaeda. Don't try to topple dictators in the Arab world through the ballots. Do it by bullets, not by ballots. And the fact that Assisi staged that coup d'etat was something that might have an impact, might have had an impact on Al-Qaeda and even organizations like ISIS and others. I mean, that the democratic way is not valid. This is what the Egyptian case has proven.
Thank you. Okay. Mustafa, если вы хотите, чтобы было палестинское государство, не больше...
Mustafa, if you want a Palestinian state, just 1 minute.
To be short, so I'll be very short. First of all, it would be a grave mistake and seriously short-sightedness not to think that the Palestinian issue is central, not only to the 340 million Arabs, but actually to the more than 1 billion Muslims in the world. If you really check, the unifying factor between all the Muslim sects is the Palestinian issue, whether they are Sunni, Shiite, or anything else. So it's a short-sighted thing by Israel to say that the Palestinian issue is not central. It will take only one attack from Daesh on an Israeli target, and I am sure the Israeli policy will change. The same applies, of course, to the fact that today there was a shooting from Egypt on Israeli soldiers, and one Israeli soldier was shot. So let's be realistic. The way to have normal relationship with any Arab country is to solve the Palestinian question. Second issue, about the Russians and Israel. I don't know whether you meant that Russia should care about the faith of the Russians in Israel, or whether Russia should be worried about the fact that many ex-Russian citizens are violating international law by becoming settlers in the occupied territories. We all know that half of the immigrants are not Jewish. This is a well-known fact in Israel. So that's a factor that one should consider. On the issue of Mr. Kerry, we, the Palestinians, appreciated so much his role. We tried to help him, but the United States policy is suffering from two problems: lack of consistency and double standard. Lack of consistency. President Obama took the right decision when he made his first speech, and he said Israel must stop settlement activities. If he stuck to that, we would have been in a different situation. But Israel threatened him, and he retreated. And Mr. Kerry was failed by Israel, which continues to insult him. And the big question for us is why a superpower like the United States is so weak in front of Israeli dictation. Finally, and it's just 2 words, I would be worried about calling a place the Sunni world. I think one has to be more careful in identifying the places, whether it's Arab world or Sunni world or Shiite world. Thank you.
Thank you. Я приношу всем, кто не имел возможность задать вопрос.
I apologize to everyone who was not able to ask a question. I did not have time for jokes like Mr. Grigoriev had previously. Let's give ourselves a round of applause.